Hi, students. I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about these handouts that give you some literary terms and definitions that might help you with your explication and give you some names for elements in the poems you're writing about. Stanzas are just these blocks of text in poems. So we know My Papa's Waltz has 4 stanzas. Oranges has 2. One is super long. In My Papa's Waltz, the stanzas are all the same size. Rhyme is just the repetition of similar ending sounds. The whiskey on your breath, breath and death, dizzy and easy. Those are rhymes in My Papa's Waltz. Rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhymes. So in the video about formal poetry, we talked about how My Papa's Waltz has a A-B rhyme scheme because every other line rhymes with each other. That's a rhyme scheme. Meter is a pattern of accented and unaccented syllables in lines of poetry. I think I said stressed and unstressed in the formal poetry video. Alliteration is the repetition of consonant sounds, particularly at the beginning of words. But a lot of you noticed in those winter Sundays, he talks about cracked hands that ached. That repetition of the K sound kind of brings up the harshness of the cold, and that's alliteration. Assonance is the repetition of similar vowel sounds. I rose and told him of my woe. Oh, 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 that's assonance. Free verse is just poetry with no regular rhyme or meter. So oranges is a great example of that. Blank verse is unrhymed iambic pentameter. We'll talk about that a little later in this semester. Formal poetry, I did a whole video for you guys on what formal poetry is, what makes a poem formal. But one way to think about it is poetry with a prescribed pattern or structure. Couplets are 2 lines, often at the end of a poem, usually that rhyme. Quatrains are stanzas of 4 lines, usually with some kind of rhyme scheme. So My Papa's Waltz is a great example of a poem made up of quatrains. Metaphors are comparisons where you say something is something else. Our love is a car running out of gas. That's a metaphor. Similes are comparisons using like or as. Our love is like a rose starting to bloom. Denotation is the dictionary definition of a word. Connotation is the implied or suggested meaning of a word. So the word fat has a very negative connotation. It's very pejorative and kind of mean. The word voluptuous suggests somebody's curvy and very attractive. So in some ways, those words mean the same thing. They have the same denotation, but they have very different feelings. In those winter Sundays, he talks about the angers in the house being chronic. Chronic just means long-lasting, never going away. That's its denotation. But its connotation, we often use chronic to talk about a disease. He had a chronic illness. So the connotation, the feeling of that word is pretty negative. Imagery is a description that appeals to one of the 5 senses. I'm going to move over to the other handout now. A few more literary terms you should know. Let me see if I can bring this one up. Iambic pentameter, I talk about in the video on what is formal poetry. Same thing with iambic trimeter, so I'll let you watch that video to understand those 2 things. A sonnet is a 14-line poem, usually with a rhyme scheme. Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets. We're going to read a few a little later. A confessional poem is a poem in which the speaker is the poet, an autobiographical poem. So Those Winter Sundays, My Papa's Waltz, Oranges, all confessional poems. Oh, Eating Alone too, actually. A narrative poem is a poem that tells a story. Oranges is a great example of a narrative poem. A persona poem is a poem in which the speaker is not the poet, a poem in which this poet takes on a voice other than his or her own. So My Mother is mostly a persona poem. We get a speaker in the beginning seems to be the poet, but then he slips into taking on, to speaking from his mother's voice. So that's a persona poem. Enjambment is the running over of a sentence from one verse or couplet into another so that closely related words fall in different lines. We'll see some enjambment and some poems in a couple weeks. I talked about the ABAB rhyme scheme in the formal poetry video. That's the rhyme scheme in My Papa's Waltz, alternating lines rhyme. And in a couple of weeks, we'll read a poem with an AABB rhyme scheme. And you can see, had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. So in an AABB rhyme scheme, the lines next to each other rhyme. So those are just a few terms that might be useful to you as you begin writing your essay one. The introductory paragraph of a poetry explication is a great place to write about, to use some of these literary terms and to write about how the poem looks on the page. This poem has 4 stanzas. They're all the same size. This poem has 2 stanzas, one really long and one really short. This is a free verse poem. This is a formal poem. This poem is a confessional poem or a narrative poem or a persona poem. All of those are things you might say, most of those are things you might say in the opening. You might point out assonance or alliteration as you go through the poem when those things crop up. So this is just a little introduction to some literary terms you should know.